We made it! Exclaimed an out-of-breath man, clutching his chest and clearly exhausted. He was not alone, his friend was curled up on the side, clutching onto something entirely different. His gaze fell on that item, a small monster cage used for transporting milder species. Inside was a small white ant, twitching around. You still took that thing with you? There is something wrong with you. Eugene sighed. During their escape, he had abandoned the cage, prioritizing his own life. Alana, on the other hand, insisted on bringing the monster with them. Now, they were certain that this ant was not born in the dungeon. A monster could not leave the dungeon it was created in, and even the strange armor that had chased them could not break this rule. Alana, despite the exhaustion etched on her face, cradled the small cage gently. The gleaming ant inside twitched, its silvery white body reflecting the moonlight. Eugene shook his head in disbelief and looked around to make sure that they were truly safe. 4 adventurers were with them, but some guards had also spotted them and began to approach. We can't rest yet. We need to get to the guild and report what happened, said one of the adventurers, his voice steady despite the fatigue he was feeling. The group knew that the armor inside the dungeon was dangerous, it needed to be subjugated. With the darkness skill around its body, it could not be killed by low-level adventurers like them. What's going on here? Glad that you asked. One of the guards sprinted over to the adventurers to ask about the problem. However, before they could answer, a high-pitched screech erupted around them. Everyone found themselves covering their ears. Alana took the brunt of this audible attack as the source was the cage with the gleaming ant inside. The small creature was giving out a spine-chilling sound as it had awoken inside of a cage it didn't want to be in. Calm down, no one is going to hurt you. Alana shouted while quickly pressing one of the magical symbols on the cage. In a flash, the piercing sound was gone, and even though the ant continued, no one was affected by the skill it was using. The group of people turned to her with puzzled looks. The girls responded by laughing nervously. Everything is under control now, she assured them while the ant continued to rattle inside the cage. It was clear that the creature didn't want to be there, but it also couldn't escape. The strange magical symbols around it seemed to be draining its stamina, and it was already injured. Soon enough, the monster tired itself out and slumped forward, its insectoid eyes glancing at the entrance to the dungeon from which it had been forcibly taken, as if longing to return. I can't. Within the same dungeon a lone living armor stood, slamming his fists at a strange invisible wall that it could not cross. He had chased down the humanoid beings that abducted his friend but was forced to stop, right before he could cross the threshold of the dungeon's entrance. Rusty, as the armor had come to be known, pounded against the unseen barrier with a sense of desperation. His friend was right there, but there was no way of progressing any further. What can I do? I need to think. Rusty retreated a few steps, trying to get a grip on the strange emotions he was feeling. He wasn't sure what to do, his friend was now gone, snatched away right before his eyes, and he had been powerless to stop it. During the chase, he had constantly used up the mana crystals he had taken from his previous lair, and only one remained. The swirling darkness around him could only function with the aid of magic doping, a state that would not be sustainable in the future. While thinking, he recalled a scene from the past. He had shot an arrow at adventurers on the 2nd floor and missed. Once they were gone, he thought nothing of it, but they called for help from stronger people. It was now quite probable that after making such a huge scene, people would be after him. Staying in this location was dangerous, so he needed to retreat first and then think of a new plan. His aim was to save Gleam, but to do that, he needed to survive first. Don't worry. I'll find you, Gleam. He glanced at the dungeon stairs that he couldn't approach, then finally turned around. The swirl of darkness emanating from his body subsided as he decided to conserve the rest of his mana. Soon he was making his way back into the dungeon that had become quite chaotic. A lot of monsters had followed after him and the adventurers he was chasing, and now they had caught up. It had been a while, but Rusty had been created on this level. Navigating them was rather easy, and even though the monsters here were now aggressive towards him, they didn't pose much of a threat. A few skeletons charged at him, but even after their blades connected with his body, they didn't cause any damage. His durability exceeded the attacking power of these low-level F-rank monsters and wouldn't even cause him to lose a single hit point. You have gained +1 experience points. They are really weak, weaker than those insectoids. With just a single hit, the skeleton was defeated, and its friends followed suit. Rusty could see how much he had grown, as dispatching the other living armors could be done with a few shoves and strikes to their body parts. Normally, he would be feeling ecstatic, but without Gleam around, it didn't feel the same. The other adventurers were luckily also busy with these monsters, which allowed him to head back down to his previous hiding spot on the first level. I hope they will have an answer. Rusty found himself at a loss for what to do. The situation had taken a turn he hadn't predicted, but all hope was not lost. While Gleam was not here, there were two other beings he could turn to for help. The hero and the demon lord had experienced this world for longer than he had, and perhaps they could show him the way forward. Thus, after making sure that he was alone, he activated the skill that would call both the guides here at once. While he knew that this would cause his mana to run dry fast, he was desperate. Well, if it isn't Rusty, that was quite the spectacle. Are you perhaps trying to become the next Demon King? First appeared a Burden, the fallen Demon King, in the form of a black orb of light. He seemed rather amused by the predicament Rusty had found himself in and couldn't stop himself from silently laughing. Next, the orb of white light appeared, representing the betrayed hero Alexander, who showed a bit more concern about Rusty's situation. It's not easy to lose a friend, you could at least try to show some empathy. Empathy? Friend? Ha, none of those are needed to become a king of demons. Just like many times before, the two started arguing with each other about things of the past. If Rusty were a being of flesh, he would be sighing now. However, this was not the time to listen to these two bickering around. He needed knowledge about how to proceed, and he needed it now. Enough, stop. I didn't summon you here for your squabbling. I need your help. Oh, how forceful. Did you really care about that little ant that much? You can just make another bonding contract later, what's the big deal? How about you worry about yourself instead? The black orb replied and tried to shift the conversation in a different direction, survival. It was clear to everyone there that once things settled down, another party of adventurers would come to flush him out, just like before. And this time, they would likely do more than just toss him down a chasm. I have to save Gleam first, but I don't know how to do that. His metal head dropped as if he was at the end of his wits. He had thought that he had evolved enough to leave the dungeon by now as the voice wasn't affecting his body anymore, and even the other monsters saw him as an outsider. However, for some reason, he was still unable to leave. Well, there are a few ways of getting out of the dungeon. You did leave it already once, right? The hero brought up this point, and Rusty realized that he was right. After falling into the chasm, he miraculously left the dungeon and the voice behind. That approach had many problems, though, as he would be attacked by shadowy spiders, and there was no way of knowing if any of those caves and tunnels led outside of the dungeon. Good point, hero, we just need to build a ballista and fire Rusty out of the dungeon. A Burden continued cackling while trying to make a joke, but it seemed that the hero had put some thought into this plan. If they accounted for Rusty's restorative powers, it was plausible to perform an escape like this. Why a ballista? If he could throw his helmet far enough, couldn't he just restore himself on the other side? I'm not sure if that will work, and even if it did, then what? Once he steps out the dungeon, he'll be as good as dead. That's probably true. There was one exit to the dungeon, and both of them knew that it was heavily guarded, with many adventurers moving between it. Even if Rusty managed to get outside, he would likely be swarmed by enemies from all directions. He could slip away, but it was quite a risky plan, not something that either of his consultants could propose. Then what can I do? Are there other exits? Probably not. But there has to be a way to get out. There might be, but you'll probably be just wasting your time. Even if you find a new exit or tunnel yourself outside, you'll still be unable to leave. The Demon Lord cackled again as if he were having fun teasing the desperate piece of armor. Even if Rusty discovered a different exit, he would still be locked inside the dungeon. However, I didn't say there isn't a way out of here. Then stop wasting time and tell me. So impatient. Rusty found himself shouting at the darkened ball of light, and the power he held over the former demonic king was activated. A Burden felt himself compelled to give a proper answer to the question and quickly answered. Then listen to Rusty. You are a monster born of the dungeon, a creature summoned by the dungeon heart. If we consider this, then there are a few possibilities. First, if you destroy the demon heart, you will be free. Destroy the dungeon heart. Rusty knew by this point that the voice inside of his head was this supposed dungeon heart. It controlled all of the monsters inside of the dungeon and was in a sense the dungeon he was in. Are you mad? Do you know what happens if you destroy a dungeon heart? The dungeon will collapse, but he will have some time to leave, that is, if he doesn't crumble with the other dungeon monsters. Don't listen to him, Rusty. The monsters that were summoned by the dungeon heart will all disappear if it gets destroyed. There was a big problem with this tactic, and both Aberton and Alexander knew it. While Rusty was a special monster and there was a possibility that he could survive, there was a significant chance that he wouldn't. This was already evidenced by his inability to leave through the front exit. It was clear that he was still considered a monster born of the dungeon, and the heart didn't wish for him to leave. Are you tired of living, Demon King? Not really, I was just answering the question. That was just one of the paths Rusty can take. Considering his special deposition, he might be able to survive, but, can you stop interrupting and let me finish? Rust nodded to indicate that he could continue with his proposition, as perhaps one of them would end up saving Gleam. I would also discourage you from destroying the demon heart. The whole place would probably collapse before you could find the exit. Then what should I do? Reason with it, with that loud voice. Funny you mentioned that, Rusty, because that's similar to what I was thinking. What are you saying? How can he talk to a dungeon heart? You humans are really something. You use these dungeons to get stronger, but you don't even know what they truly are. The hero was confused by the cryptic proposition, but there was apparently more to the dungeon than he expected. Alexander, like the other adventurers, had used the dungeon to get stronger and richer. Never once did he think about what these dungeons were. To everyone, they were more like natural resources than intelligent beings. The dungeon hearts aren't quite intelligent beings, but they act like them, and this we can use to our advantage. If my speculations are correct, then if our little Rusty could present himself as a big enough threat to the dungeon heart, it would sever the connection by itself. Soon, Aberton laid out his entire plan, and Rusty started listening to the theory. It was rather simple. The dungeon heart apparently had a connection with each monster inside the dungeon. Through this connection, the dungeon monsters acted as a sort of antibodies, protecting the body that was the dungeon. Everything was connected and in a sort of balance. However, once Rusty appeared, it affected this balance, and the dungeon heart saw him as an anomaly. While the dungeon saw Rusty as an anomaly that needed to be purged, it still maintained its connection to him. It didn't want to destroy him, but rather have him die once and restore him to the being that had been summoned. In this way, it would get rid of the anomaly without losing the resources it used to create him. But how will I cut this connection with the dungeon? I see a few ways. One possibility is to simply get stronger. Perhaps once you evolve, the connection will be severed. Other than that, you could create some chaos. Kill as many monsters as you can, and if that fails, perhaps injuring the dungeon heart could work. Once it sees you as a true threat, it will probably cut the connection. Remember, the dungeon heart is a living being, and every living being feels fear. Rusty processed Aberton's words, feeling some apprehension about the deed. Destroying the dungeon heart sounded incredibly risky, but if causing enough chaos or getting stronger was something he could manage. Do you really think this could work? It sounds plausible, and the skill compels him to speak the truth. Hey you two, I can hear you. Rusty asked Alexander for confirmation before trusting the words of the Demon King. It seemed that a plan was forming. To save Gleam, he need to cause enough damage to the dungeon for it to see him as a real threat, and for this to happen, he would need to delve deeper down and face stronger foes. Are you sure? It's quite probable. Your ant friend should be safe for the time being, probably for another month, that is if they haven't changed the guild rules since my untimely demise. Let me explain. A white orb replied to a strangely relieved-looking suit of armor. A plan was made to cause chaos and escape in this dungeon. However, this did not fix the immediate problem of Gleam being captured. Rusty posed a question about his friend's safety, and the hero, familiar with the ways of adventurers, gave him some good news. The ant. Her name is Gleam. Sure. Gleam will probably go through an examination process. They will likely discover that she is under a bonding contract with someone. Normally, this will make them assume that she is owned by a tamer. A tamer. Tamers are people that use monsters and beasts as their weapons. They are able to subjugate and control these creatures through these contracts, with the bonding one being a bit special. Usually they use it for their first monster. Since Gleam bonded with you and you are still alive, the contract will come up during the first examination. So, that means that. The hero sighed as he continued his explanation. He wasn't sure what to make of Rusty. Sometimes, Rusty reacted like a child who didn't know anything, while other times, his mind was sharper than an adult's. His ability to strategically take out adventurers using traps showed his high intelligence, but he lacked a lot of the common sense a human would have. That means that Gleam will be treated as someone's tamed monster. There are laws prohibiting others from harming such monsters. That's great. So that means that Gleam is safe. At least for the time being. Time being? Is there more to it? Yeah, there are certain rules, or at least there were, but everything is on a timer. I think it was around a month. If no one claims a bonded monster, the guild would seize it and more than likely allow the people who captured Gleam to take possession of her. Even though you have a bonding contract, such things can be forcefully removed even if the owner is still alive. Rusty nodded at this revelation. It seemed that there were a lot of strange rules in the outside world populated by these humanoid beings. Luckily, these rules were working in his favor, as for the time being, it seemed that Gleam would be safe. Captured monsters like her would need to remain at a certain facility, and once there, they would stay for a month. During this time, nothing would happen to her, but eventually, after the timer ran out, the people who captured her could claim her as their possession and probably overwrite his bonding contract with a more unfavorable one. This meant that he had around a month to turn this place upside down and leave the dungeon he was born in. Good, that will be enough, thank you. No need to thank me, I'm just nothing but a skill. Stop being such a downer, little hero. The two lights started to vanish as Rusty cancelled the skill before his mana ran out. During the conversation, he had already used up his last mana crystal to prolong their talk. He was now back to square one on the first floor of the dungeon. The only difference was that he was now being hunted not only by the adventurers but also by the dungeon heart. It wanted to kill him and restore his form to the one it could control, something he could not allow. How should I start? If a burden is right, then I might have to attack the dungeon heart directly or gain enough levels to evolve further. Rusty found himself back in the dim, musty corridors of the dungeon's first level. His metallic body was still and silent as he contemplated his next steps. The weight of his newfound purpose, saving Gleam and breaking free from the dungeon, pressed heavily onto his armored shoulders. I'll need to get stronger and do it fast. A month seems like long but it's not. Name: Rusty. Classification: Twilight Bronze Armor EL3. Type: Magical/Inorganic. Hit points HP: 140/140. Magic points MP: 129/129. Special points SP: 40/40. Strength: 24E. Agility: 6E. Dexterity: 10E. Constitution: 25E. Intelligence: 12E. Wisdom: 14E. Willpower: 12E. Durability: E+. Rusty glanced at his status screen and his stats. After having defeated the insectoid monsters inside the chasm, his progress had stagnated. His rank was E-, and fighting F- ranked monsters didn't give him more than one experience point. It was clear that he had to delve into the lower levels of this dungeon to find stronger prey. However, there was also a different option: fighting adventurers, something the hero had tried to dissuade him from doing. These humanoid adversaries would yield more experience points but were quite troublesome. The more he killed, the more likely they were to call for reinforcements. If he did too much damage, he would probably be forced to hide for a while, a tactic his helpers had already mentioned. A burden offered another solution, which would be the safest: Rusty could simply bury himself in a hole and wait a few months. Eventually, the adventurers would forget about him, and the dungeon monsters would not be able to see him if he was hidden behind a newly created wall. With his pickaxe, making a temporary shelter wouldn't be hard. His disposition as living armor didn't require oxygen or food for survival, so he could just stay there until everything blew over. However, such an approach would put Gleam's life at stake, and he did not want to risk that. The lower levels it is then. I need to go deeper and level up more. With a resolve set, there was nothing else for Rusty to worry about as he decided to delve deeper into the dungeon before the adventurers could organize themselves further. While they posed a problem, within the dark and musty dungeon, he could conceal his presence. His enemies were searching for a living armor, but his form didn't look much different from his dungeon brethren. One of them was right before him, slowly approaching, weapon drawn as it charged forward. Was I really this slow before? It felt strange to see the corroded armored pieces coming at him and being dispatched in a matter of moments. He didn't even need to hit them with his sword, a few punches and kicks were enough, and probably better. Slashing damage was something his body was quite resistant to, but there was still a limit, which he observed just now. After one of the armors went down, another charged at him. In response, Rusty raised his sword hand and brought it down with the help of his power slash skill. His sword connected with the monster's shoulder and dug in deep. The corroded form, riddled with holes, could not hold and was sliced apart. A massive gash appeared on the monster, which died instantly. His E-rank weapon was powerful enough to cut through the F+ durability. With this amount of strength, he felt confident in progressing. Thanks to the sheer number of monsters here, it would probably not take that long to gain the experience he needed. Compatible materials found. Would you like to refine this armor into base materials? I probably won't run out of bronze either. His brethren were made of bronze which he could absorb with the help of his skill. Even though he ran out of mana crystals, he would have a way of restoring his body to a seemingly infinite amount. With this in mind, he could let loose and not care about his well-being. As long as his helmet remained intact, he would be fine. There was another bonus to returning to the dungeon besides being able to absorb materials from weapons and monsters. He had another use for his absorption skill that he hadn't been able to utilize for a while. The skeleton approaching him with a mace was the perfect subject to see if it still worked. It charged forward, but with one sidestep and a quick swipe, Rusty disarmed the monster, its limbs landing on the ground. Compatible skills have been found. Please choose a skill that you want to learn. Basic blunt weapon proficiency. Passive skills. A skill that makes it easier to wield blunt weapons like clubs and maces, is required to unlock more powerful blunt weapon skills. It was a similar type of skill to basic swordsmanship and even encompassed more than one type of blunt weapon. At first, he wished to limit himself to as few weapon types as possible, even thinking that more than 3 would have been too much. However, his 2 guides were different type of creatures as they actually required sleep and rest. Rusty on the other hand, could function all day and night, using his weapons and leveling up skills constantly. What are my strong points? Rusty pondered his approach and concluded that using multiple weapons could become his fighting style. He could switch out new ones and repair old ones during combat. Just like with his javelin throw, he could ambush his opponents when they least expected it. There were all kinds of weapons in this world, none definitively better than another. This was showcased by his body, which could shrug off slashing attacks but crumbled under blunt hits that indirectly damaged his monster core. Then there was also the Soul Forge, a place where he could construct all types of weapons. What was the point of the blacksmithing skills he was learning if he couldn't even use the weapons he was creating himself? He could customize them to fit all his needs, and in the future, enchanting could also be possible, something that could bridge the gap between skills as well. The ability to craft and enhance his own weapons would give him a big advantage, allowing him to adapt to various combat situations and opponents. Let's take this skill, but maybe overdoing it is also bad. Getting a polearm instead of a spear should be enough. I don't really need to overlap when the weapons are similar. Thus, with his mindset and priorities clear, he headed back down to the lower level floors. The second level presented not much of a challenge as the monsters there weren't all that strong. Nevertheless, he kept to the side tunnels he remembered and made his way to an old location. There he found some old friends in the poison-filled leeches. To his dismay, others decided to come out to play. The ruined graveyard he could previously just walk by was activated as if he were one of the adventurers. Zombies and skeletons emerged to stop his plan, or at least become a minor inconvenience. These monsters were rather slow and not particularly bright. Rusty had seen adventurers clear out this cavern and knew how to handle them all, even by himself and without a priest. A zombie's head tumbled to the side and was quickly followed by another one. The best tactic here was to defeat the zombies while they were rising up from their graves. It took them a while to do so, and with swift movements, Rusty made quick work of the rising undead. His blade cleaved through the air, severing limbs and decapitating heads before the creatures could fully emerge. It was an efficient method that minimized the number of active threats, but it was still not perfect. The graveyard was large, and some monsters were still able to rise. By the time Rusty reached their position, they had already fully emerged. He swung his blade in broad arcs, each swing taking down one foe. Skeletons were also present, and with his new mace skill, he could easily shatter their fragile bones. While he would need a skill to use 2 weapons at once more efficiently, against such low-level targets, his current abilities were enough. Soon, the number of undead enemies dwindled, and he had successfully cleared the area without needing to use his light element. You have gained +1 experience points. You have gained +1 experience points. You have gained +1 experience points. The experience points came, but they were quite meager. Even after all the monsters were dealt with, his experience bar had not budged at all. It was clear that he should leave quickly, as this place wasn't worth his time. Luckily, the poisonous exploding leeches were able to enter his inventory. With them around, he felt a bit safer, as they worked wonders on the adventurers. They would be his trump card if he ever got surrounded. Rusty tried to focus on his journey, but his mind kept drifting back to memories of his old friend, Gleam. He wasn't sure what these emotions truly were, but the more he thought about her, the more something hurt inside him. To distract himself from this strange new pain, he decided to concentrate on other things, like the armor pieces he had picked up from the other living armors. While they were not made out of twilight bronze, they were the same size as his own body parts. He had stored a few pieces inside his storage space but could also place them in his stash tab. On the system screen, the icons representing equipment weren't quite lifelike and resembled two-dimensional sprites. He had two versions of the armor, one belonging to the corroded variant of his old body and the other to an evolved bronze variant he had vanquished in the lower levels. As he walked, Rusty started playing around with these items and placed one in the spot of his left arm. To his surprise, the corroded piece replaced his left gauntlet, which felt quite normal. He couldn't feel any reduction in his stats, but this piece was certainly less durable than the body part made of twilight bronze. While it wouldn't be the best option, he could still replace damaged parts with others. Perhaps he could even use different types of body armor, like the ones the humans were wearing. After a few more tests, he realized there was an interesting exploit. Once he replaced his arm with the lesser damaged variant, he was given the option to repair it. It cost the usual ingot amount, but his system created a brand new arm identical to the original. It seemed that, through this method, he could produce replacement limbs for future use. This discovery was intriguing as it allowed him to stock up on undamaged parts. This trick didn't work with weapons, though. He could only restore the ones he himself created. He wasn't sure why, but perhaps the monster parts were seen differently since they came from similar monster variants with identical builds. The weapons, on the other hand, were more universal and could be used by many other creatures. I should go back down and explore that 5th level. The monsters there gave a bit more experience than these. With a determined mind, he set off on his journey. He had a month to gather enough experience to challenge the dungeon heart, and he intended to do it. Once the connection was severed, he would move above ground, where a whole new world would await him. Hey, be careful. I don't think it likes that. Calm down, it's just a monster, it probably can't even feel pain. Now, let me do my job. A middle-aged man with a scruffy beard let out a sigh as he tried to yank an insectoid monster from within a cage. The cage was placed on a strange-looking metal table, adorned with various magical symbols pulsating around a magic circle. Despite his efforts, the monster did not resist, or more precisely it could not. Instead, it only emitted peculiar chirping screeches. Once it was out, its form was revealed to resemble that of an ant. It wasn't that large, yet only perhaps the height of a middle-sized dog. As the ant was extracted from the cage, its chirping became more frantic, echoing through the sterile, well-lit room. The walls were lined with shelves holding strange tools, and jars with monster parts. The scruffy man placed the ant on the table, within the confines of the glowing magical circle. Hold still. He muttered while shouting at the monster. Initially, it seemed the creature would resist, but once the magical inscriptions began glowing red, its strength was suppressed, rendering it immobile and paralyzed. With the creature now disabled, the man reached to the side for a toolbox filled with various implements. From the toolbox, he took out something resembling a monocle with an elongated lens. It had a series of elastic strings attached which allowed him to secure it to his head. Well! The man was not alone, 2 others were with him, a young woman and a man, who urged him to hurry up. This annoyed the middle-aged man, who continued to sigh in protest. Soon, he activated the magical lens on his head, allowing him to view the monster's hidden status screen. I have some bad news for you, Missy, you can't take this thing back. Why not? I knew it, that thing must be cursed. No, it isn't. The middle-aged man shook his head as he adjusted the monocle, allowing it to zoom in on the finer details of the magical status screen hovering above this ant. The screen displayed various attributes and a blinking red line indicating a bond. See this? He pointed to the glowing line. This monster has a bonding contract. That means it already belongs to someone else, probably a tamer. The young woman who had been anxiously observing the process stepped closer. She could not see the status screen that the man could see with the help of the magical monocle. The only thing she could do was to ask the man, hoping that he was not lying. "Are you sure? We go this monster from the dungeon, could you be mistaken?" The man let out another sigh and was quite annoyed with the assumption that he could not do something simple as read a monster's status. "I read the report, but that doesn't change the fact that this monster has a bonding contract and also a name." "A name?" The woman was surprised by the revelation. Monsters didn't usually have names, it was something people tended to give themselves, and tamers were the same. If this monster had a name, it was likely given to it by its tamer during the establishment of their contract. This confirmed the man's claims that this monster belonged to someone and complicated things. "But it was in the middle of nowhere, are you sure that the tamer didn't just abandon it there? Are they even alive?" The middle-aged man scratched his beard, considering the woman's question. He adjusted the monocle once more and looked through the monster's status to find the answers. "It's hard to say for sure. The contract is still active, which suggests the tamer is alive, but it's possible they could be far away or even unable to return for some reason. It might be possible that they abandoned it, but we still have to follow the procedures and post a notice first. You should know the rules." She clenched her hands into fists at her sides. She knew the rules well but had hoped for a loophole that might allow her to keep the unusual ant she had found. The rules were in place to protect both tamers and their bonded monsters, ensuring that no one could claim a bonded creature without due process. "Fine. How long do we have to wait? And don't think I won't write a complaint to the guild master if you dare to sell it off at an auction. Why would I do such a thing?" This ant was quite unusual and rare. While it was still just an F-rank monster, its rarity was something that would entice a lot of researchers and collectors. She had to make sure that this person didn't pull some tricks. "I wonder why." She rolled her eyes and continued speaking, which soon turned to shouting. "The rules state that the person who discovered the monster first gets to keep it. Do I also have to remind you that you'll be held accountable if something happens to it? Don't think that I won't take you to court, and do you know who my master is?" "I know the rules, lass. Calm down, it's just a procedure." The man was taken aback by the reaction of this young lady. Her friend that was with her needed to start holding her back. "Sorry, she is just a little bit tired." "Alana, calm down already." Alana took a deep breath, trying to rein in her frustration. Her friend's words were a welcome reminder to keep her emotions in check, especially in a situation like this. This didn't keep her from angrily shaking him off and landing a kick against his shin. "You don't need to remind me, Eugene." "Ow. Fine, let's just follow the procedure then. But I'm keeping an eye on you, old man." "Sure, that's fine, just fill out the required paperwork," she warned, pointing a finger at the middle-aged man who seemed unperturbed by her threat. With that settled, they began the process of documenting the ant's discovery and the presence of the bonding contract. It was a tedious task, involving paperwork and numerous signatures, but necessary to ensure that everything was done by the book. "Gleamhui? I guess you'll be staying here for a while." Eventually, the process was finished, and the two young people left, leaving the ant creature behind. It was now alone in the room with the man, who brought out a trolley with a similar magic circle on it. The monster could not move and was defenseless. "Here, this will be your new home for a few weeks." He carted the monster to a separate large area, with many more creatures everywhere. The room was spacious, with cages lining the walls and various magical apparatuses scattered about. Gleam felt weak but started looking around to discover that the strange magical suppressing magic was everywhere here. All the cages here were imbued with similar magical circles, keeping the monsters within powerless and subdued. Soon, she too was moved over to one of them, which was not much bigger than the one she initially arrived in. "This thing is supposed to only eat magic crystals? Well, as long as it lives until the deadline, it should be fine, right?" The man mumbled to himself while shoving Gleam into one of the smaller cages. Around her, many monsters opened their mouths in protest, but the enchantment seemed to silence any sound. Gleam felt trapped and helpless, surrounded by strange creatures in a place she couldn't understand. Despite her fear, she reminded herself that she was still alive, and that counted for something. Things looked grim, and though she was being suppressed, Gleam clung to the fact that she was still alive. The magical inscriptions on these cages were strange, but they still emanated mana, something she, as a spell-slinging monster, was born with. Perhaps, if she tried hard enough, there would be a way to free herself and reunite with her one and only friend, whom she was certain was looking for her. Compatible skills have been found. Please choose a skill that you want to learn. Basic Polearm Proficiency. Passive Skills. A skill that makes it easier to wield pole arms, is required to unlock more powerful Polearm skills. Basic Two-Handed Proficiency. Passive Skills. A skill that makes it easier to wield larger and longer weapons with two hands, is required to unlock more powerful two-handed skills. So, I'll need both of these for a Polearm and something like a greatsword. Rusty looked at the defeated bronze armor before him. It bore a striking resemblance to him, its monster core embedded within its helmet. Activating the skill absorption on his lookalikes was proving troublesome, as his helmet couldn't be placed over theirs. Instead, he needed to remove both their limbs and scatter them so they couldn't reform themselves. Only then could he place his helmet onto the living armor's torso to initiate the process. He had been warned by the Demon King not to abuse this skill too much, but Rusty needed to grow stronger. As planned, he decided to acquire the Polearm skill first, giving him something with long reach. After the absorption process, the skill went into cooldown, rendering it unusable for several days. It hadn't been long since he gained the skill required for mace use, and he noticed that the more frequently he used the absorption skill, the longer the cooldown period became. However, after abstaining from its use for a while, he observed that the cooldown period shortened, a fact he realized after refraining from its use while fighting insectoid monsters. It was as if just like the Demon King, the skill in itself didn't want to be used often and saved for really important skills and not for basic ones. While this might have been true for humans, he was a monster who couldn't pick up these skills through regular training. He was locked to a set of abilities given to him by his evolutions. You have gained plus 23 experience points. Even the F+ monsters don't give me that much experience, I must go in deeper. Rusty crushed the monster core embedded in the living armor's helmet to defeat it. This served as a stark reminder of how vulnerable he was if someone managed to obtain his own helmet. These cores were quite brittle, and Rusty pondered if there was any way to safeguard them. Perhaps, if he could access the Soul Forge, he could insert some type of protective layer. His biggest fear was sustaining a blow to the head with a mace or some other hard object. While there were ways to reinforce his core and helmet, he would have to wait until his next evolution to make such adjustments. It had been a few days since his return to the dungeon, and Rusty was still struggling to adjust to the persistent animosity. Everything within its confines was his enemy, with no safe spots or crystal cavern to use. The only silver lining in this bleak environment was the abundance of bronze armors he could use for resources. With their parts, he didn't truly need a safe area to hide in, as he could repair anything that broke on his body. I wonder how far down this place goes. The 5th level he now traversed was quite spacious, though not much different from the preceding floors. However, it provided access to areas he would normally avoid, those infested with a bothersome creature known as the Goblin. Now deemed an enemy of the entire dungeon, Rusty found himself considering hunting these monsters. Much like humanoid adventurers, goblins fought in packs, albeit with inferior equipment. However, their gear contained a metal he previously lacked access to, iron. His current goal was to save Gleam, and to achieve that, he needed to grow stronger. His metallic body was his greatest asset, and upgrading it further was his best path to gaining power. Rusty was well aware that bronze wasn't the most durable metal, and advancing to iron and eventually, steel was necessary. Previously, he had been unable to separate iron from the weapons wielded by adventurers, but now, as an E-rank monster, he potentially could overcome that limitation. To test this theory, he needed to delve into the goblin-infested floors. Fortunately, this 5th floor boasted a bustling population of these green-skinned devils. GG. It's not like the other monsters. These small creatures behaved differently, reminiscent of Rusty when he was younger. Unlike the mindless skeletons, zombies, and living armors, the goblins seemed capable of assessing the danger level of their opponents, at least to some extent. They never attacked when alone and instead attempted to lure their enemies into traps or ambushes. It was no different for Rusty as he began making noise and then turned to flee. While Rusty was still an inexperienced dungeon dweller, he could tell that something was wrong. Such obvious tactics would not work on him, but he still wanted to hunt some of these green goblins for their crude iron weaponry. Luckily, he had just gotten a new type of weapons in the Polearm that he lifted from the living armor that was holding it. To save on his own Twilight Bronze, he started to sometimes use the weapons other monsters dropped on the ground. Once he was holding on to them, the dungeon could no longer absorb them either. "You're not getting away. With the power throw skill at his disposal and the bardic in hand, Rusty prepared to strike. It went under the umbrella of poleaxes, with the main difference being its elongated, curved blade at the end of the pole. It wasn't quite shaped like an axe, but thanks to this, it could still be used for throwing. After activating his active skill, Rusty timed his throw precisely. The weapon hurtled towards the retreating goblin and connected solidly with its back. The goblin let out a high-pitched shriek as it stumbled forward, tumbling to the ground with a thud. Rusty rushed forward, his metallic form clanking with each step, to finish the job. He wasn't interested in a prolonged fight, he needed to dispatch his enemies quickly and efficiently. As Rusty approached the fallen goblin, it attempted to scramble to its feet, but the injury was too severe. Blood flowed onto the ground, and with one follow-up attack, the monster fell, lifeless. The experience points he received were fewer than those from the bronze living armors, but that wasn't the aim of this confrontation. Instead, he focused on the goblin's weapon, which in this case was a crude iron dagger. Compatible materials found. Would you like to refine this weapon into base materials? Material 1. Iron 20%. Material 2. Nickel 5%. His visor pulsed with glee as he was presented with the option to extract the iron metal from within the dagger. Though it wasn't much, Rusty understood that if he mastered the mechanics behind this skill, after 4 more absorptions, he would be rewarded with 1 iron ingot. With this revelation in mind, he delved deeper into the tunnel that the goblin had tried to lure him into, eager to continue his hunt for both experience and resources.